On behalf of my husband, David Eggert, and myself, we appreciate the invitation to be part of this afternoon's moral movement. We've traveled a bit to get here. We're from the east side of Cleveland, and we're glad to be here with you. David and I are co-founders of an organization called God Before Guns, which is a multi-faith coalition formed to end gun violence. This is not our first time in Columbus. No doubt it will not be our last in these halls of our state government, because the issue of ending gun violence is too important to ignore. We have, with our organization and with our churches, been all over the state of Ohio, and we have cried out, no more silence, no more names, not one more. And yet, before we go to bed this evening, likely 86 persons in our country will die at the wrong end of a gun. 3 of those will be in Ohio. We have a disproportionate share of those deaths in Ohio. So every day matters to the families of Ohio who are affected by gun violence. I'm a pastor, and I serve a congregation in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and I began my activism in this issue on February 27th, 2012. Do you know what happened on Monday, February 27th, 2012? The shootings at Chardon High School. It was a day when the youth of my church, my junior high and high schoolers, were going to be in the building for a youth event. We have families who were there at the high school that day during the shootings. I didn't know if any of our kids would come that afternoon. It had been a traumatic day. But every single one of them came. And we were together in their youth space, a place where they feel safe and loved and secure. And we cried about what happened. We prayed about it. We talked about it. My eyes were opened that day when I found out that every single one of the children in my church, from schools all over Cleveland, have been on lockdown. They don't just know the drill. They have been on school lockdown. They have sheltered in place for real. Well, that was in February, and it was just months later. I was preaching just 2 days after the Sandy Hook shootings, in which 20 children were gunned down in less than 5 minutes. I couldn't ignore the tragedy, and that day, my sermon, I began with a book, a children's book, Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. If you had that book read to you, have you read that book to someone? Well, it's about Alexander, who probably was a first grader. And the day doesn't start out well for him, and it gets worse as it goes on. I mean, he trips on a skateboard in the hallway when he wakes up. He drops his sweater into the sink, and it gets all wet. He doesn't get the window seat in the carpool. His teacher criticizes him because he's singing too loud. There's no dessert packed in his lunch. It's a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. That should be the stuff of a child's life. While I was preaching, other pastors in Newtown were preparing memorial services for first graders. How do you write one obituary for a first grader, and then how do you write 19 more? My life changed that day, and I could no longer stand idly by. So now we are immersed in this work with God Before Guns, and I shudder as I hear in so many ways from so many voices how guns are held sacred in our country. I hear the Second Amendment defended as being more important than the 10 Commandments. Or for me as a Christian, somehow the Second Amendment is lifted up as superseding the Great Commandment to love God and to love neighbor as ourselves. And I am angry that the Ohio legislature reinforces this in so many ways. And there was that spring Saturday morning when I stood with parents of young children in a small municipal park in Oberlin, when armed men from other parts of Ohio took over the park, claiming their right to carry guns in that park, that Ohio's laws of preemption allowed them to be there no matter what the townspeople of Oberlin wanted. I was part of a conversation this morning in Mayor Jackson's office in Cleveland, where Mayor Jackson is asking for new laws to be considered and approved to give Clevelanders the right to keep themselves safer from gun violence that is plaguing our city. Now, these city ordinances, if they are passed, will be argued and fought, and the city of Cleveland likely will be sued because of preemption, a law that pertains only to guns. I have walked the downtown streets of Cleveland in a hoodie in solidarity with Trayvon Martin's parents, knowing that the Ohio legislature will consider again this fall a stand your ground law that will make it easier rather than more difficult to justify shooting to kill. I have testified against House Bill 231, which will grant access for guns to be taken in churches, in daycare centers, in airports, places that previously were exempt from allowing guns. And now, as school has started for the fall semester, I pray for those schools, those children, and those teachers, schools that are arming teachers, knowing that Ohio law allows this. Children have a right to grow up in Ohio. I read the other day, Slate magazine called Ohio America's capital of accidental child shootings. Now, I don't like the word accidental, because for a child to have access to a loaded gun, it has to pass through the hands of an adult first. And Ohio has no law on the books for child access prevention, although more than half of our states do, including Texas. Ohio does not. And that needs to change. God Before Guns will be working this year to form alliances. We will be working to build a statewide coalition to make child access prevention a priority. And I pray that God will strengthen our resolve, that God will bring power to our voices, and that God will grant us the courage to use them. Oh, in your great mercy, God, hear our prayer.